Chapter 11. The Interior of a Heart. After the incident last described, the intercourse between the clergyman and the physician, though externally the same, was really of another character than it had previously been. The intellect of Roger Chillingworth had now a sufficiently blind path before it. It was not, indeed, precisely that which he had laid out for himself to treat. Calm, gentle, passionless as he appeared, there was yet, we feared, a quiet depth of malice, high-hearted, but active now, in this unfortunate old man, which led him to imagine a more intimate revenge than any mortal had ever wreaked upon an enemy. To make himself the one trusted friend to one should be copied all the fear, the remorse, the agony, the ineffectual repentances, the backward rush of sinful thought is expelled in vain. All that guilty sorrow hidden from the world, whose great heart would have feared and forgiven to be revealed to him, the pitiless, to him, the unforgiven. All that dark treasure to be lavished on the very man to whom nothing else could so adequately pay the debt of vengeance. The clergyman's shy and sensitive reserve had backed this sham. Roger Shuttleworth, however, was inclined to be hardly, if at all, less satisfied with the aspect of affairs, which Providence, using the avenger and his victim for its own purposes, and perchance pardoning where it seemed most to punish, had substituted for his black devices. A revelation, he could almost say, had been granted to him. It mattered little, for this object, whether celestial or from what other region. By its aid, in all the subsequent relations between him and Mr. Dinsdale, not merely the external presence, but the very inmost soul of the latter seemed to be brought out before his eyes, so that he could see and comprehend it every moment. He became thenceforth not a spectator only, but a chief actor in the poor minister's interior world. He could play upon him as he chose. Would he arouse him with a throe of agony, the victim was forever on the rack. It needed only to numb the spring that controlled the engine, and the physician knew it well. Would he startle him with some sudden fear, as at the waving of a magician wand, uprouse a grisly phantom, uprouse a thousand phantoms, in many shades of death, of more awful shame, all flocking round about the clergyman, and pointing with their fingers on at his breast. All this was accomplished with a soundness so perfect that the minister thought he had constantly a dim perception of some evil influence watching over him. He would never again a knowledge of its actual nature. True, he looked doubtfully, fearfully, even at times with horror and the bitterness of hatred, at the deformed figure of the old physician. His gesture, his gait, his grisly bear, his slightest and the most indifferent acts, the very fashion of his garments were odious in the clergyman's sight, a token, implicitly to be rarely known, of a deeper anticipation in the breast of the latter than he was willing to acknowledge to himself. For, as it was impossible to assign a reason for such distraught and abhorrence of Mr. Disley, conscious that the poison of one morbid spot was infecting his heart's entire substance, attributed all his presentiments to another cause. He took himself to task for his bad sympathies in reference to Roger Chillingworth, disregarding the lesson that he should have drawn from them, and did his best to root them out. Unable to accomplish this, he nevertheless, as a matter of principle, continued his habits of social familiarity with the old man, and thus gave him constant opportunities for perfecting the purpose to which, poor forlorn creature that he was, and more wretched than his victim, the avenger had devoted himself. While thus suffering under bodily disease, and gnawed and tortured by some black trouble of soul, and given over the machinations of his dearest enemy, the Reverend Mr. Dinsdale had achieved a brilliant popularity in his sacred office. He won it, indeed, in great part by his sorrows. His intellectual gift, his moral perception, his power of experiencing and communicating emotion, were kept in a state of preternatural activity by the prick and anguish of his daily life. His fame, though still on its upward slope, already overshadowed the several reputation of his fellow clergymen, eminent as several of them were. There were scholars among them who had spent more years in acquiring abstruse lore connected with the divine procession than Mr. Jesus had lived, and who might well, therefore, be more profoundly versed in such solid and valuable attainments as their faithful brother. There were men, too, of a studious testure of mind than his, and endowed with a far greater share of spirit, heart, iron, or grating understanding, which, daily mingled with a fair proportion of doctrinal ignorance, constitutes a highly respectable, efficacious, and admirable variety of the clerical species. There was other, again, true saintly fathers, whose faculties had been elaborated by Aristotle among their books, and by patience, thought, and elixir, moreover by spiritual communication with the better world into which their period of life had almost introduced this holy personage. With their garments of mortality still clinging to them, all that they lacked was the gift that descended upon the chosen disciples at Pentecost in tongues of flame, symbolizing, it would seem, not the power of speech in forgiving an unknown language, but that of addressing the whole human brotherhood in the heart's native language. These fathers, otherwise so apostolic, like heaven's last and readiest attestation of their office, the tongue of flame, they would have vainly sought, had they ever dreamed for of seeking, to spread the highest trust throughout the humblest medium of familiar words and images. Their voices came down, afar and easily, from the upper heights where they habitually dwelt. Not improperly it was to this latter class of men that Mr. Disney, by many of his traits of character, naturally belonged. To their high-mounted peaks of faith and sincerity he would have climbed, had not the tendency been guarded by the burden, whatever it might be, of crime or anguish, beneath which it was his doom to totter. It kept him down, on a level with the lowest, him, the man of other attributes, whose voice the angels might else have listened and answered, but this very burden it was, that gave him sympathy to so intimate with the selfless brotherhood of making mankind, so that his heart vibrated in issues with theirs, and received their pain into itself, and sent its own throe of pain through a thousand other hearts, in gush of sad, persuasive eloquence, oftenest persuasive, but sometimes terrible, The people knew not the power that moved them thus. They deemed the young clergyman a miracle of holiness. They fancied him the mouthpiece of heaven's messages of wisdom and rebuke and love. In their eyes, the very ground on which the throne was sanctified. The virgin of his charge grew pale around him, victims of a passion so imbued with religious sentiment that they imagined it to be all own religion, and brought it openly, in their white bosom, as their most acceptable sacrifice before the altar. The aged member of his flock, beholding Mr. Disney friends so feeble, while they were themselves so ruined in their infirmity, believed that he would go heavenward before them, and enjoin upon their children, that their old ones should be buried thus to their young pastor's holy grave. And all this time, perchance, when poor Mr. Johnson was thinking of his grave, he questioned with himself whether the grass would ever want it, because an accursed thing must there be buried. It is inconceivable the agony with which his public veneration tortured him. It was his inner impulse to adore the truth, and to reject all things shadow-like and utterly devoid of weight of value, that had not its divine essence of the life within their life. Then what was he? A substance? Over the depths of shallows? He longed to speak out, from his own pulpit at the full height of his voice, and tell the people what he was. I, whom you behold in these black garments of the priesthood, I, who ascend the sacred desk, and turn my pale face heavenward, taking upon myself to hold communion in your behalf with the Most High Omniscience, I, in whose daily life you discern the sanctity of Enoch, I, whose footsteps, as you suppose, leave a gleam along my hard-laid track, whereby the pilgrims that shall come after me may be guided to the religions of the blessed. I, who have laid the hand of baptism upon your children, I, who have breathed the parting prayer over your dying friends, to own the eminent soundness fairly from a world which they had quite. I, your pastor, when you saw reverence and trust, am early appellation and ally. More than once, Mr. Disney had gone into the pulpit with a purpose never to come down its steps until he shall have spoken words like the above. More than once he had cleared his throat and drawn in the long, deep, and tremulous breath which, when sent for again, will came burned with the black secrets of his soul. More than once, nay more than 100 times, he had actually spoken, but how? He had told his hearers that he was altogether vile, and vile companion of the vilest, the worst of sinners, an abomination, a thing of unimaginable impurity, and that the only wonder was, that they didn't see his wretched body shivered up before their eyes by the burning wrath of the Almighty. Could there be plainer speech than this? Would not the people start up in their steads, by a simultaneous impulse, and tear him down out of the pulpit which he defiled? Not so, indeed. They heard it all, and did but reverence him the more. They little guessed what daily purpose lurked in those self-condemning words. The good Leon said they among themselves, the saint on earth, alas, if he discerned such sinfulness in his own white soul, what horrid spectacle will he behold in thine or mine? The minister well knew, subtle but remorseful hypocrite that he was, the light in which his vague confession would be viewed. He had striven to put a sheet upon himself by making the avowal of a guilty conscience, but had gained only one other sin, and a self-acknowledged shame. without the momentary relief of being self the same he had spoken the very truth, and transforming it into the very falsehood. And yet, by the constitution of his nature, he loved the truth, and loathed the lie, as few men ever did. Therefore, above all things else, he loved his miserable self. His inward trouble drove him to practice, more in accordance with the old corrupted form, that with the better lie of the church in which he had been born and bred. In Mr. Dean's secret closet, under the looking-gate, there was a bloody scourge. Of- Oftentimes this Protestant impuritan divine had laid it on his own shoulders, laughing bitterly at himself the while, and smiling so much the more perilously because of that bitter laugh. It was his custom to, as it has been that of many other vicious Puritans, to fast. Not, however, like them, in order to purify the body and render it the fitter medium of desolation illumination, but rigorously, and until his knees trembled beneath him, as an act of penance. He kept busy likewise, night after night, sometimes in utter darkness, sometimes with a glimmering lamp, and sometimes viewing his own face in a looking-glass, by the most powerful light which he could throw upon it. He thus typified the constant introspection weather-white hitherto, but could not purify himself. In these long vigils his brain overthrilled, and visions seemed to flit before him, perhaps seen doubtfully, and by a faint light of their own, a remote dimness of the chamber, or more vividly, and close beside him, within the looking-glass. Now it was a herd of diabolic shapes that grinned and mocked at the pale minister, and beckoned him away with them. Now a group of shining angels, who flew upward heavily as sorrow-laden, but grew more ethereal as they rose. Now came the dear friends of his youth, and his white bird fire, with a saint-like frown, and his mother turning her face away as she passed by. Ghost of a mother, tiniest fantasy of a mother, methinks he might yet have thrown a pitying glance towards her son. And now, throughout the chamber which these spectral thoughts had made so glassy, gleamed Hester Prynne, leaning alone little pair, in her scarlet garb, and pointing in her thin finger, first at the scarlet letter on her bosom, and then at the clergyman's own breast. None of these visions ever quite deluded him. At any moment, by an effort of his will, he could discern substances through their miserable lack of substance, and convince himself that they were not solid in their nature, like yonder table of carved oak, or that big, square, leather-bound and breasted clave volume of divinity. But, for all that, they were, in one sense, the truest and most substantial things which the Prime Minister now dealt with. It is the unspeakable misery of a life so false as his, that it steals the piercing substance of whatever realities there are around us, and which were meant by heaven to the spirit's joining nutriment. To the untrue the whole universe is false, but is impalpable; its strings do nothing within his grasp. And he himself, in so far as he shows himself in a false light, becomes a shadow, or indeed ceases to exist. The only truth that continued to give Mr. Dinsdale a real existence on this earth was the anguish in his inmost soul, and the undissembled expression of it in his aspect. Had he once found power to smile, and wear a face of gaiety, there would have been so much more. On one of those ugly nights, which we have fairly hinted at, but forborne to picture forth the minister starting from his chair, A new thought had struck him. There might be a moment's peace in it. Uttering himself with such care as if it had been for public worship, and precisely in the same manner, he stole softly down the staircase, undid the door, and issued forth.